If I stand tall, it is because I stand on the shoulders of those who came before me. An appropriate proverb as we recognize the courage and contributions of civil rights giants during Black History Month. Good morning and welcome to Black Almanac. Sitting in for Dr. Ed James, I'm Renee James Gilmore. The justice system has been both friend and foe to African Americans, and one never truly knows which will show up on any given occasion. But this is certain: just us will be stripped of life, liberty, and dignity unless Black communities and American institutions together deliver new solutions to the centuries-old problems stemming from racial biases. The judiciary influences every Black family, every Black life. During the 1940s and 1950s, trial lawyer Thurgood Marshall won 29 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. The cases demanded new types of conversation around legal segregation and social justice. Thurgood Marshall was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1967, making him the first African American seated. For today's program, we visited the first African American to serve as Chief Judge of Florida's 12th Judicial Circuit. Judge Charles Williams talks about the shoulders he stands on and offers his unique perspective on social justice. Judge Williams, someplace in Florida right now, I bet there are African Americans being encouraged to enter law school because it's believed that the rule of law is a way of truly making this country great to live in for everyone.
I agree with that, and being a proud graduate of Howard University as an undergraduate, Howard University was instrumental in the law as it related to social change. So it's sort of inbred in Howard graduates that they're going to be social engineers. And that was the mission and vision of those Howard lawyers who transformed this country through the law, like Thurgood Marshall. So I feel that the law is the best way to transform this country and make it more equal for all of us.
Wonderful. Now, there are some statistics that we all hear, and we hear them on a regular basis, that might make one say, is there a good formula right now? Do we have a good formula for how the law is administered and who's involved in it? Let me just read a couple of stats that I know you're familiar with. The Federal Bureau of Prisons reports that 38% of inmates are Black, and that was from January 18 data. The Florida Department of Corrections reports that Blacks comprise 43% of the prison admissions. Yet the American Bar Association says that there are only 5% of the attorneys in the entire nation are Black Americans.
And a surprising statistic, at least in Florida, there are actually more African American physicians per capita than African American lawyers, and there are a variety of reasons for that. One of the major reasons, I think, is the fact that we don't target students early enough to consider careers in the law. And one of the proud things that we are doing here in Sarasota locally is partnering with the Booker High School Law Academy to encourage more young people to consider law as a career. Those statistics about the incarceration rate of African Americans are absolutely shocking. But it's not shocking to someone who has actually worked in prisons, who've represented people who unfortunately have been sent to prison. This disproportionate number of African Americans, I think, is reflective of a lot of different things. Social and economic lack of opportunity, the fact that unfortunately many African American communities are targeted by law enforcement, that many of the laws disproportionately affect African American defendants, minimum mandatory sentences, the lack of the opportunity to have very good legal counsel in many times. All of these come together to add to that disproportionate rate of African Americans that are incarcerated in our justice system.
Let's talk a little bit about that representation, particularly of by Black attorneys of African Americans, and how important that can play in terms of a role for getting equal justice, if you will. I know that you had the opportunity to meet the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Devil in the Grove. Tell us a little bit about that story and how coming out of those kinds of times. That was in 1949, this Devil in the Groves. And Thurgood Marshall himself represented these four young men when they were very young, or when he was very young, rather. Tell us a little bit about that and how times have changed in terms of protections against the horrors of being taken into custody if you're an African-American man.
Well, most people know of Thurgood Marshall as his time as a Supreme Court justice, and that was a proud time in America's jurisprudence. But what a lot of people don't know about Thurgood Marshall is that he was an excellent trial defense lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer. And prior to him taking the bench, he would go throughout the South, many times in danger to himself, to represent people who were wrongfully incarcerated, people who were wrongfully arrested, and people who were wrongfully convicted. Gilbert King won the Pulitzer Prize for a book called Devil in the Grove. And Devil in the Grove reads almost like fiction because you can't believe that these things actually occurred. In 1949, 4 young African-American men were rounded up. They were arrested. They were accused of raping a white woman. They were treated, unfortunately, like many African-American defendants in the South during that period of time for those types of crimes. They were beaten. They were tortured. Confessions were basically beaten out of them. And Thurgood Marshall heard about this case. And he felt that it was important for him to come down to Florida, and Groveland's not far from Orlando, and it's still there, to basically do whatever he can to prevent those 4 young men from meeting what would probably be a death sentence if they were convicted. And so what Thurgood Marshall found wasn't too unusual to find in the South during that time and in many other parts of the country. And that is the sheriff, a person by the name of Sheriff McCall, basically ran the town. There was no such thing as the Constitution as it applied to African Americans. There was no such thing as reading your rights. There was no such thing as a writ of habeas corpus. He basically rounded up these 4 young men. He basically beat confessions out of them. In fact, in the book, he tried to murder one of them. So these are the types of things that Thurgood Marshall was confronted to, not only a racist sheriff, but a racist justice system, a prosecutor, a judge, who never gave any respect to African Americans, much less African American lawyers. And Thurgood Marshall came to Groveland, Florida. He was assisted by both a black and a white lawyer. And Devil in the Grove tells the story of the struggle that Thurgood Marshall had finding justice for them. In fact, one of the defendants, one of the African American defendants in that case, was killed. One was incarcerated for a tremendous amount of time. But Thurgood Marshall fought through that, and through the appellate process, they were ultimately exonerated. But it didn't help the one who was murdered, and it didn't help the one...
Before he even got to trial, is that
absolutely. He was absolutely faced with a sheriff who thought nothing of shooting or gunning down an African American defendant prior to the trial. And that's what happened to one of the defendants in that case. Gilbert King won a Pulitzer Prize for that. I've had the opportunity to actually develop a bond and friendship with him. He's written a follow-up book, and he'll be back in this community on May 10th to talk about a book that follows up on what happened in Groveland.
Justice Williams, so oftentimes judges seem to be kind of invisible in their communities, but that's not so with you.
Well, it's pretty important for me in terms of what I feel is important in terms of role models. Everyone, and I don't talk about role models lightly. I am a judge and a lawyer prior to that because of lawyers and judges that I saw in my community that looked like me. There weren't very many of them, but we knew about them. My parents instilled in me the fact that you have to be involved. You have to make certain that you don't leave anyone behind, especially our own people. And so it's important for me to be in any community, and I have pretty much adopted Sarasota as my hometown, that it's important that I be active in the community. It's important that I get out there, that I attend events. And some of the events that I enjoy attending aren't very well, let me just say this. It's very important to accomplish your goal as a lawyer in terms of convincing young people that it's possible to achieve the dream of being a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. And so for me, what I enjoy more than anything is really talking to young people, talking to students in elementary school and middle school. And I do that a lot because, number one, teachers are very near and dear to me. Both of my parents were teachers. And so I think it's important for me to get out into the community to let people know that almost anything is possible. In fact, anything really is possible if you really, really are determined to do it. And so I see that sort of as my mission, in addition to being a judge and before that being a lawyer. It's all a part of helping people, and I think that's very important for us to do.
Let's talk a little bit about role models and young African Americans having the opportunity to see people actually in the courtroom when they're not standing before the judge, unless they're attorneys, of course. But even the law itself, the admission to law schools, has had a bleak history in this state, if not across the country, as it regards law schools just rejecting black applicants almost out of hand. You went to Howard, I understand, as undergraduate, but you came back to Florida to go to the University of Florida's law school. Tell me about what Howard might have done to prepare you, coming out of Thurgood Marshall's alma mater, if you will, coming out of that as undergraduate school and going to school at University of Florida. Even in the 1980s, Florida was still a place where black young people seen on college campuses at majority schools was still in the making, if you will, and they weren't always embraced.
Absolutely, and the history of the University of Florida Law School isn't necessarily a great one when it comes to race relations and black students. African American students could not attend the University of Florida until the early 70s. In fact, when I enrolled at the University of Florida, it was still under a federal court order to desegregate. And Howard University prepared me in terms of what I think all historically black colleges and universities do for their students, and that is instill them confidence and pride in who they are. And there's no doubt that I would not have been successful at the University of Florida had I not attended Howard University. When I came out of Howard University, there was a famous Supreme Court case called Bakke versus the University of California Board of Regents. That Supreme Court case outlawed what were up until that time quotas and set-asides for African American students and minority students in certain graduate programs. There was a lot of resentment from white students because they felt that any African American that was in a law school or a med school or a PhD program or an engineering program was only there because of affirmative action. So when I entered the University of Florida, the Bakke decision was still being decided. And so there were many white students at the University of Florida who felt that I didn't deserve to be there, that I was taking up a seat only because I was an African American. So for the African American students who enrolled with me in my class, and I'm proud to say there were 23 of them, all 23 of us graduated. One transferred to go to George Washington University just to be close to home. But 22 out of 23 of us who entered that class, we all graduated and we all achieved success. But it wasn't easy. There was always constant challenges to who you were intellectually. There were always constant challenges as to why you were here and that you didn't deserve to be here. And so we didn't necessarily blaze a trail because there were other African American students who did that, but it was very, very difficult, even in the late 70s and early 80s, for African American students in predominantly white schools, and probably still is today.
You know, we talk about black history, and as we have this discussion, there may be people who think, oh, that was a long time ago, but when you consider that it's within our lifetimes right now, and we're old, but we're not so old. But when you consider that the history that we're talking about now really wasn't so long ago.
It's not, and one of the big challenges that we try to do is educate our young people about our history. You know, I am probably the last generation who actually experienced pure segregation, meaning that I remember growing up that there were certain beaches that I couldn't go to. I couldn't go to in St. Petersburg. There were certain sections of town that I could not go to, and it was understood. And so I can remember as a child growing up in St. Petersburg, going to a movie theater in anticipation of seeing a show that I really wanted to see and being turned away simply because I'm black. Children and young people today are generations removed from that, and they don't understand how bad it was, not only in St. Petersburg, but here in Sarasota. And so I think what happens a lot of times is they are not prepared like the generation who had to endure that type of segregation. And so sometimes it's surprising to them when they are treated badly because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity or because of the way they speak. Growing up in a segregated St. Petersburg, just as growing up in a segregated Sarasota, gives you a certain amount of body armor. You understand what people may think of you just because of your skin color. That's sort of missing from the more recent generations, and they learn that the hard way. But I am proud of how African Americans have responded. I think movements have come that have recognized that we are not yet free and that we are still continuing to fight for everything that we have in every field, not just the law, but in medicine, in business, and even in athletics. We still are not accepted as equals. And so this generation is learning what past generations took for granted. And I think it's very impressive to see how they're reacting to it.
In full disclosure, I am a Florida A&M graduate. And I can tell you we have talked many times in our family and households about Florida A&M's law school, that in 1949, Florida A&M, a predominantly black, historically black university, had a law school. And it was important because, again, blacks were being rejected out of hand to go to law schools. In the history of the United States, we've only had about 4 or 5 law schools at any given time, so it was important to have them. But in 1968, Florida A&M's law school was closed because it was said that with the new one opening at Florida State University, there was no need. It was redundant, and so the law school that was there in Tallahassee originally was closed down because of redundancy. But the Rattlers fought, and now we have Florida A&M University's law school in Orlando now. When students start asking you about good law schools, good experiences, how do you weave in, or do you even weave in, the possibilities of a Florida A&M law school as you talk about others, your alma mater and others?
Well, I think historically what happened to the Florida A&M University Law School is a tragedy. Prior to the Florida State University Law School being built and being open, Florida A&M provided a quality education, and there were many fine Florida A&M University Law School graduates, many of whom became mentors of mine, people who I knew. The closing of Florida A&M University's law school is typical for what happened. Prior to Florida A&M University, if you were an African American, they would send you out of state and pay for it before they would allow you to go to the University of Florida. And so what happened with Florida A&M University when it closed was a tragedy. But by reopening Florida A&M University, albeit in a different location in Orlando, it still tells us that we do need HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, because they have a special mission. There was a special mission for students who went to Howard University's law school. There was a special mission for students who went to Florida A&M University's law school. And we recognize that. And I think now that Florida A&M University is up and running again as a law school, hopefully that mission hasn't been lost, and hopefully those graduates will be some of the social engineers that were produced prior to Florida A&M University's law school being closed. But it's very, very important to have these institutions because Florida does not have a lot of African American lawyers, contrary to what many people may think. This community, we have less than a dozen African American lawyers who practice law on a regular basis in this community. And for a community this size, we have to start generating more and more lawyers. And so these institutions are very important. And getting students early on board in terms of going into the law is very important. And I continue to encourage that.
You've been on the bench for 20 years now.
Hard to believe.
And recently, I'm going to say recently, in the last couple of years, you've talked about the need for, right here in Sarasota, for us to have a serious conversation about race relations. Since you made that assertion, have those kind of discussions started to take place from your perspective?
Well, I'm very proud of the conversation series of race issues that I've been involved with through my work at Florida Studio Theater, where we have these conversations. I'm very proud to say that the combination of the arts community and the legal community have formed relationships in which we bring together people in both fields, the arts and the law, to talk about issues involving race in certain plays and productions that are here. The most difficult conversation for Americans to have, as hard as it is to believe, is a conversation about race. We talk around it, we think about it, we're afraid to say things about it, so we still need those conversations. More and more independent organizations and nonprofits are having these conversations about race. Soon there's going to be a 3-day symposium about race relations that's going to be happening in this community. We will continue to try to foster dialogue between different parts of this community to talk about issues of race and ethnicity. I think it's more important than ever that we have these conversations, because if you can't talk about it candidly, you're not going to be able to find any solutions.
Can you tell us a little bit about the symposium?
There's a 3-day symposium that's going to be held in March, and I can get the details to you at another time, but I believe it's in the middle of March. It's going to be at the Fogartyville Peace and Justice Center. It's a 3-day symposium that's sort of tailor-made for people in the community who are involved in diversity and inclusion initiatives, people who are taking leadership roles in the community. And it's my understanding that it's going to be an intensive 3-day program in which everything's going to be laid out. The issues involving race, the reasons why we can't talk about it, and more importantly, action plans that will be developed. And so we're looking forward to that occurring in the community. I was fortunate enough to be on the planning committee for that, but we hope that maybe at least 40 community members can take part in this 3-day intensive symposium and come out better at the end of it and do more for this community in terms of getting people together in terms of race and ethnicity and coming together for a common purpose.
You have been busy on this front. I understand that you are one of the founders of the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion in the Sarasota Bar Association.
Very proud of that. One of the things that I noticed coming into this community years ago was the lack of African Americans in the legal profession, in all aspects of the legal profession, not just as lawyers, but in the paralegal field, people who worked in the court system. And so we started a Sarasota County Bar Association Diversity and Inclusion Committee with the sole purpose of improving the number of minority lawyers in this community. We have been very, very fortunate. We've received a lot of support from the legal community. And our first goal was to get second-year law students to consider Sarasota, minority law students, to consider Sarasota as a place to work and ultimately open a practice here. We have given out probably about $100,000 in scholarships to those law students. We have been fortunate enough to have 6 or 7 who have actually began to practice here. We're very proud of that. But we are now focusing on younger students, and so we're very excited about our partnership with the Booker High School Law Academy, in which we're going to start developing and shaping, hopefully, young graduates from that law academy to consider going into careers in law. And we'll work with some of our local colleges to make certain that anybody graduating from the Law Academy program that wants to have a field in the law, they're not going to be set back because of financial reasons or a lack of support. So we're very, very proud of our work with Booker.
Social justice. What does that term mean when we speak it or when you speak it?
You know, I actually think of an individual. I do think of Thurgood Marshall when I think of social justice. And if anyone does research, not of Thurgood Marshall as a justice, but as Thurgood Marshall as a lawyer, you can see what he thought of in terms of what was social justice in this country. All of the significant gains that we've made in voting rights, all of the significant gains that we've made in housing, all of the significant gains that we have made in the criminal justice system in terms of equality, initiated for the most part from lawsuits that were filed by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. For Thurgood Marshall, social justice was being accepted as a full citizen, having all the citizenship rights that you are given under the Constitution. For me, it involves that, and it involves more. It involves being active. Social justice is not static. You have to go out and force the hand of those who resisted. And there are many people that resisted. There are many people that feel that as an American, you don't have to do anything but be an American to be happy in this country, and we know that that's not true. That those of us who have been denied justice traditionally have to continue to fight for it. And so for me, social justice is history in terms of what people like Thurgood Marshall accomplished, and it's also things like what we try to do at the Booker Law Academy, and that is make this community reflective of what America should be, of what Sarasota should be, and it's a constant battle for social justice. So I look at it as the pride of the history of social justice and the pride as an African American I have in the role that we had, making America very inclusive, not just African Americans, but the laws that were made benefited all Americans as a result of the civil rights struggle. So I'm very proud of that, and very proud of the legacy that we're trying to develop, and very proud of the people that will be following us. And I always tell people it's not important that I was the first African American judge in this community. What's important is I'm not the last one. And that's what I really fight for, and that's what I'm really striving for, to make certain that that's not the case.
So when you talk about legacy, I know you said one of the most important things is that not that you're first, but you won't be the last. What other things do you want people to think about when it's your time to go move along and have somebody else sit in that seat?
Well, to recognize that you just can't be satisfied sitting in the seat. To recognize that you are not truly free as an African American in this country until everyone who looks like you is free. That's a lesson that we all learn growing up in this country. If you haven't learned that lesson, then you are missing your education. I think it's very important to understand that we cannot be satisfied, that we cannot just sit on our laurels and be happy that we've accomplished great things. That's not what we're put here for, and I think we're all here for a reason. And I think if you're put in a position as a chief judge, or if you're put in a position as a doctor, a lawyer, or a teacher, or a nurse, or someone who takes care of old people, you have an obligation not only to do the best job that you can, but to make this community and make the people around you better. And I see that as my role almost as much as being the chief judge, and that is to try to make this community better because of being here. And I think that's something that many people accept who don't get interviewed and people aren't aware of, that do their jobs every day, making this community better and taking care of their families and taking care of people. And it's a humbling position that I'm in, but I know that there are people out there that are working hard every day that are doing the same thing that don't get the accolades.
Yourself, about the judiciary, about careers in the profession, before we close.
I like the Sarasota community to know, especially the people who have embraced me, how fortunate I feel. I really feel the warmth and the embrace of the community, especially the Newtown community, which I try to be as active as possible in. You have embraced me. You have made my job easier because I know that I can make a difference. And I appreciate all the prayers. I appreciate all the support. I appreciate the fact that you feel comfortable to come up to me and talk to me about anything, not only having to do with law, but anything else. And I feel that I am a true community partner, and I could not feel that way if I did not have the love of the community, and I appreciate that more than you know.
Thank you, Judge Williams.
Thank you.
Zupan, part of the U.S. Paralympic rugby team. In my game, movement is everything. I get frustrated when my move is blocked, especially when that guy has no right to be there, even just for a minute. I love a challenge, but I don't like to play this game every day.
A message from the United Spinal Association.
Growing up, my mom was afraid of the water, something she did not want me to feel.
So I enrolled Missy in swim lessons.
It changed my life.
Missy Franklin.
And now you can do the same for someone that you love.
There's nothing more precious than your child's well-being.
So act now, before it's too late.
I'm glad I did.
Thanks, Mom. Visit usaswimmingfoundation.org to find, get, or give a swim lesson.